What's up, everybody, and welcome back to Cultish, where we enter into the kingdom of the cults. Before this episode begins, I want to point you to thecultishow.com/blog/Kemet. That is a blog written by Dnew, the dear sister in Christ that we interviewed for this next series, that is about Kemeticism. Please go there, because Kemeticism is a mixed bag of topics and beliefs, and this blog will really help you understand the worldview behind the people and movement that we are speaking about, the conscious community, in a sense. Also, guys, we are listener supported, and we are in need of your support. So if you are feeling led to donate, please go to thecultishow.com/donate, and you can donate one time or monthly. You help us keep the lights on, and we thank you for all that you do.
Through the course of history, there have been intentional moves to keep the knowledge of ancient Kemet away from people, the people, definitely from Black people and from the world at large. Being that a lot of the modern day world religions are highly based upon Kemetic or ancient Egyptian spiritual knowledge. That being the fact, it was necessary, I would say, to hide that information in order to give us a pure dose of indoctrination, per se, without us being able to see its ancient origins.
All right. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Cultish, entering the kingdom of the cults. My name is Jeremiah Roberts. I'm one of the co-hosts here. I'm joined, as always, by my trusted friend, Super Sleuth and co-host up in Harriman, Utah, Andrew, the Super Sleuth of the show. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing well. I am doing well, and soon I will be moving because my lease is up. So where will I be then? That's the question. And will you give that away as well?
I know.
Jerry?
We'll just have to see. I mean, I pretty much gave your location away already. And, of course, you have your very exquisite, luxurious, expensive neon sign in the background.
Yep, it's about $40,000, right?
Exactly.
$40,000
Very,
neon
very
sign.
exquisite. So we are going to be talking about a very interesting subject today. We're going to be talking about, I'm trying to figure out how we even begin to, for anyone who's never heard about this group before, we're going to be talking about like Kemetic Spirituality. I first heard about this by way of, it was with, I met you back in February at Doctor on the Block that Vocab Malone was hosting at his church. And then he had done a presentation on people who say that Jesus never existed, kind of appealing to a lot of stuff brought up in Zeitgeist. But then he kept on mentioning the conscious community. And so I'm like, who are they? Who is this conscious community? And then I went to your breakout session, and I was fascinated by your presentation. Really glad you could come and join us. So why don't we just start, how would we begin with this? 'Cause I kind of feel like this whole conversation, this is like there's a big picture, like the zoom out big picture, and then you have like the zoom in like Google Maps, right? So you have countercult apologetics, you have like a map of the United States, that would be your typical cults, very well known, like Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, Scientology, like mainstream stuff that people know. And then, you know, when you look at, you know, we'll be unraveling like the urban apologetics or urban countercult apologetics. That would be like a map of LA. And then when you actually look at Kemeticism, like that's like a back alley somewhere in the backdrop of LA somewhere with two people having like an intense conversation is the way I would describe it. Is that an accurate assessment, or how do we explain this to anyone who's listening in?
You know, for some individuals, it is the main street, right? It's the main street. It's very familiar to some people, but then to others, it is that back street. It depends on who we're talking about. But that is a good analogy. Okay.
So you have kind of like three different categories. You have, well, first of all, you know, you're passionate about the subject of urban apologetics. How that, I mean, usually Christian apologetics is just a defense of the Christian faith. Like, how would you define like urban apologetics? When I hear urban, that just sounds a little bit more like gritty and intense, like kind of like rolling up your sleeves or something like that. Like, how would you define that?
So, you know, urban apologetics is really basically contextualized apologetics, where you're still responding to people's objections, you're still responding to their questions, but the conversation is going to sound different than it would, say, around a, mainstream apologetic. There's just different people, different groups of people have different reactions to Christianity. And so, you have to meet people where their objections are. And so there's some conversations that will never be held in mainstream apologetics.
Right.
Like you will never go to, say, Biola University, and you will never, get a course that says, is Christianity the white man's religion 101? That's not going to be a course that's offered. You're not going to get a women's studies course that explores, is the black woman God? You're just not going to do it.
Right.
But we still need to talk about these things, because even though they're not mainstream discussions or conversations, they are very prevalent discussions in other arenas. And so that's what urban apologetics addresses. It addresses conversations that are contextualized and that aren't discussed mainstream.
Yeah. And so what I'm curious about too, and maybe you can unravel this as well too. So you have in the category of urban apologetics, in this case, you're talking about groups that are dealing with, let's say talking about like European oppression, or in this case, if you heard this video, we played a video from somebody. I just typed in Kemetic Spirituality, and sure enough, we have a guy making claims that a lot of the ideas from the ancient world were stolen by the Europeans and stuff like that. So when you look at one of the categories of urban apologetics, you call it like the conscious community. And from my understanding, and Andrew, if you have any thoughts too, you can jump in as well too. It's that there's certain categories of groups similar to like the Hebrew Israelites or the Nation of Islam. In this case, Kemeticism, where it's a type of spirituality, but it's specifically focused on the black community. But it's also trying to figure out how the best way to describe it is someone from totally on the outside looking in. They are basing their spirituality kind of off of that assumption that, they have areas in which there's been legitimate oppression and colonialism and stuff like that. But then they base their religious group off of that. Am I on to something? I'm trying the best I can to describe it.
When we talk about the conscious community as a group, it's important to define terms, because especially in this cultural climate that we exist in, conscious can mean different things.
Yes.
So when we talk about the conscious community in this context, a good way of defining it is just defining conscious. What does conscious mean? Conscious brings with it this idea of being awake and being aware of, your surroundings and who you are. Anyone who works in the medical field will understand this, that, there's a way to assess a person's level of consciousness, and that's to ask them some questions. You ask them if they know where they are. You ask them if they know what time it is.
How many fingers am I holding in front of you?
Absolutely. But one important thing that translates well to the conscious community from the medical field is you ask them if they know who they are. That's a question about identity. Yeah. And so when we're talking about the conscious community, what we're talking about are ideologies that are based on identity. They're identity-driven ideologies. And so you mentioned before Hebrew Israelism. Hebrew Israelism is a very good example of a conscious community member. Their whole doctrine is based on their claim that they are the descendants of the biblical Hebrews. Yeah. You have to understand that and acknowledge that and accept that before you go further into the doctrine. There's other ideologies in the conscious community as well. Things like, I'll name a few, the Nation of Islam, NOI, the 5%ers, Morris Science Temple. All of these groups, they differ. There's some similarities, but they differ as well. But all of them are identity-based ideologies that address people of African descent.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Yeah. What would you want to ask, Andrew?
Yeah, I was going to say, with regards to Kemeticism, would it be that they're conscious in the terms of, like you were speaking the definition, awake, aware? I think it's almost in terms of specific for Kemeticism is it's almost woke politically and then also woke spiritually in the sense of racial struggle and identity as well. Is that something that's specifically tailored to Kemeticism? Because they would, during my own research, there's lots of LGBTQ going on within Kemeticism and things of that nature. It's very politically fueled into their spiritualism. Is that unique to them?
Well, There is a difference, and I think it's important to make this distinction because sometimes when you go on the internet and you're getting information about Kemeticism, you might come across something that's called Kemetic Orthodoxy. Kemetic Orthodoxy is very different from what we're talking about here. The Kemeticism that we're talking about here is strictly at being a conscious community ideology is strictly about identity for people of African descent, whereas Kemetic Orthodoxy is not that. It's European. In fact, the leader is a European lady. So, as well as Kemetic Orthodoxy acknowledges that they, are religious. Kemeticism, as we're talking about it today, it does not own religious affiliation or religion affiliation. So there's differences there. But, it's important in these conversations when we're talking about this that, there's a specific reason why these are identity-based ideologies. It's no secret, what the history of Black people on the Western Hemisphere, where we come from, right? And in this conversation, it's important for us to remember that identity and dignity, both of those things were violently stripped from people. Yeah. And so all of these ideologies, the goal is to regain dignity and in identity. And so that is the thing that drives this ideology and all of the ideologies that are housed in the conscious community.
Yeah, so why don't we do this, like defining terms. So from my understanding, you can clarify too, is so Kemet. So Kemeticism comes from Kemet, and Kemet it's a word that basically describes ancient Egypt. That's a term. So it used to be called Kemet before that. Is that how do you define Kemet? Yeah,
so Kemet is basically what the country that we called Egypt today, what it used to be called. There's other countries in the world where the name has changed, right? And Egypt is one of those countries. It used to be called Kemet. It is now Egypt. And so you can interchange. You can say ancient Egypt equals Kemet.
Okay.
And then Kemeticism, that suffix there, ism, right, is the ideology.
Right. So it's just interesting too, and Andrew, you can let me know your thoughts. When I was thinking about, okay, this is sort of the Hebrew Israelites, except it's New Age and it's based in Egypt. And that's interesting because the only thing that comes to mind when it's Egypt and New Age is like ancient aliens, like pyramids and like UFOs and kind of like everything that entails with that, like all the ancient alien stuff. Define, because you have a couple books here as well too. That define like what that actually looks like for them. Like, what are they actually trying to recover? Is it authentic, and is it authentic spirituality that they practice? Because like when I think of ancient Egypt, I'm thinking like the pyramids. I'm thinking like the Mummy with Brendan Fraser. I'm just trying to like think of like what that entails. What's that game like Hounds and Jackals? I'm thinking like anything like culture like Egypt, but what does it actually look like for them?
So this is one of the fascinating things because when I started to, dive a little bit more deeper into Kemeticism, I think that when you do that deep dive, you also have to look at ancient Egypt, right? Because the claim from people, I should say, in the Kemetic community is that Black people need to make a return or a rediscovery of their African spiritual roots. But here's the thing that's interesting is that when you go and look at ancient Egypt, you see that there's not a lot of congruency. It's totally not a return, not that return that they're telling everyone else to make. So, for example, I mentioned it a few moments ago. This is just a simple one. Ancient Egypt was very religious, highly religious, right? They had all indicators of religion. They had priests, they had belief in a deity, they had a code of ethics, they had religious festivals, rituals. They were, by all intents and purposes, purposes, a religion. The Kemetic community today disowns the notion of religion. They will, in my experience, you'd be hard-pressed to find a Kemetic practitioner who owns being religious or that they practice a religion. And so that is a very superficial example of how, ancient Egyptian religion is not what we're totally seeing from the Kemetic community.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting
today.
too, because when they're talking, they're sort of making almost like New Age claims where you can sort of become your own god or rise to like a higher level of consciousness. And again, I'm someone, again, from the outside looking in, I would assume that ancient Egyptian spirituality would be worship or adherence to the specific, deities in ancient Egypt. They think of like Osiris or the other ones that would entail Egyptian spirituality. I'm just curious too, like where did this all when did this actually start? Is this a recent movement as well too?
Well, I want to say this as well, just off the jump, in case I don't get back to it. This is a very vast, non-monolithic community.
Yeah.
And so it's almost, I would say, in my humble opinion, it's almost impossible to talk about this ideology in absolutes because different people believe and hold to different things. So I'm just going to throw that out there. But to your question, what was your question? Sorry.
Like where you thought this kind of like originated? This seems to be kind of like very modern.
Yeah. Yeah. So, when you're talking about when did it popularize in the African American community, that would have been, 1940s. But the interesting thing is that it was kind of, it was held by Europeans first, right? People like Kersey Graves, very well-known and prominent Europeans held to these ideas that are some of these ideas that come from the Kemetic community today. But to answer your question, it became popularized in academia as well as street level in the 1940s by individuals who essentially just took the teachings of European scholars.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. Like, what is, like, if you could just find like a Kemetic spirituality, I mean, do they have sort of like their own like church service, and do they have any particular rituals? I mean, they kind of, like, at least the video one of the videos that you had sent me, it seemed like it's kind of, you can kind of make it do as thou wilt, where you can kind of assemble it, together. But like, are there community gatherings, and if so, like, what do they do? Is there a sermon? Is there any sort of like, do they have their version of like communion or the sacraments? I mean, I don't know. What does that look like at all?
So again, disclaimer. It's different.
Broad.
Very broad.
Some general examples, I would say.
So, you do have individuals who are more ritualistic and who do the prayers, who do libations, who do, specific ceremonies that were done in ancient Egypt. You have those individuals. And then you have individuals who don't do all of that. Really, the thing that drives this ideology is a couple things, is two things. And then wherever you go from there is, in my humble opinion, fair game. So those two things are a hatred of Christianity, okay? Because to people in this community, Christianity is seen as the white man's religion, and it's seen as a representation of colonialism, of European colonialism. And so there's a hatred of Christianity. And then the second thing that, again, is consistent between all conscious community ideologies is that there is some level of I will call it disdain for Europeans and or European culture, again, for what they represent. And so, there's a vast again, range of this disdain. It can be small, wide, tall, narrow, but those are the two consistent.
One thing I noticed was in the videos that specifically gave comparisons of Kemeticism versus Christianity. Like, I was watching it, wanting to know, okay, what is Kemeticism? But in it, they were more just like dogging on Christianity versus that. It seemed to be more their catalyst to kind of curb stomp it or shake their fist at it. That definitely seemed to be like a major issue.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, when you look at Kemeticism, is that they are saying that true authentic spirituality is originated in Kemet, and it's based in cosmology, which is creation myths. And Christianity, and probably ultimately any other worldview, but specifically Christianity, which is interesting, is that these are essentially copies. It's a counterfeit of authentic spirituality. So in the same way, thinking of their worldview, you know, like Walter would say, the existence of a counterfeit predicates the authenticity of an original. And so a big part of countercultural apologetics is becoming familiar with who Jesus is, and his claim to deity, and just everything about his divine nature, because every single cult, they always distort that Jesus Christ is God come in the flesh. So in the same way, Walter Martin would talk about how the way he had someone he knew that they became familiar with detecting counterfeit currency by studying the original, right? So that's an illustration that Walter Martin gave of countercultural apologetics. But they, from their perspective, they would view Christianity as a counterfeit. This is somehow a copy off. So it's strictly, so in other words, on some level, like the European culture came in to Kemet or to Egypt, and they took all aspects of authentic spirituality, but they made it their own thing. But specifically, not just they could have their own thing, but in order to oppress them and to enhance their colonialism. Is that kind of like really what's projected with what they talk about?
Well, you're mentioning the whole copycat thing. That is very prevalent in the community. This idea that Christianity is merely a copy, and it is because of what you said, the colonialism, right? Just being taken over by the European culture, as well too. You know, no one can deny that ancient Egyptian civilization is old, right? It's very old, and so the idea that Christianity is stolen from that, I think, comes from those two things.
Yeah. And its example, Andrew, what are some thoughts that you have?
Yeah. So what is their view kind of on the Bible or even the Exodus, right? Like the ancient Israelites in Moses, do they believe that essentially the Bible we have today and the stories from the Old Testament have been manipulated by the white man or the Europeans? Because the stories of the Israelites, they're definitely not white, right? And they're definitely not European. And so how do they handle that? Do they think that, actually Moses was, obviously he was the son, right? He was like a prince essentially of Egypt. Do they think that he was more than that to them? Do they think that there's been something lost in the Bible? Like, how do they handle those things?
So a couple of things I can say about that. First of all, there's individuals in the community who give no credence to the Bible. There's people in the community who believe the Bible to be fairy tales. And so they don't think that anything in the Bible actually historically happened at all. So you have that group of people. But then there's other groups of people who do acknowledge that, you know, Moses spent time in Egypt. Joseph spent time in Egypt. The Israelites spent time in Egypt. Jesus spent time in Egypt. And so this all contributes to the idea of Christianity biting from Egyptian religion, because they did spend time in Egypt. So that supports their claim. That supports their claim,
Well, I think it's also good to as we unravel this, is that a lot of their claims is very similar to just not just like other fringe groups that get into pseudo-history like Zeitgeist or kind of into that weird, where Jesus is a copy of the different, he's just a copy of just other pagan myths that are out there, or Jesus is a copy of Osiris or whatever.
So it seems to me that there's almost like a separation within Kemeticism, regardless of the individual's personal convictions and beliefs of exactly how to live that type of life is being someone who practices Kemet, essentially. I don't know how I would say that correctly, but it seems like there's almost like a form of African atheism with Kemeticism, and then there's also the type of African spirituality as well, and you can fall off into almost two groups. Is that something that is true, or are all of them essentially spiritualists in nature?
So we can kind of go back to the question that we discussed before, the issue that we discussed before when you asked about, I think, Jeremiah, you asked about, is ancient Egyptian religion what we see being practiced today? Mm-hmm. So Africa as a continent historically was definitely not atheistic. There was a supernatural world. Everyone had a belief in a god. Every African traditional religion identified a god that might have been removed from humanity, right? They might not have been having direct interaction with the god that they believed in, but there was a god. The interesting thing is that there are some Kemetics who are atheistic, which is very fascinating to me. How are we practicing an African religion and you don't believe in a god? That's very un-African.
Yeah. No, I mean, Africa is inherently like just a very spiritual climate. You can like feel it. Like I've been to both Morocco, which is predominantly a Muslim country, but I've also been to Kenya. And just both of the times I've been to both there, especially Kenya, you could just feel it in the air. Mm-hmm. Like it's just a predominantly like spiritual climate for sure. What I think is just interesting is that while this is a very micro niche group within the context of urban apologetics, I think, however, the aspects of pseudo-history that are brought up, while this is a very unique group, you see things about, the Bible being put together by Constantine. Joe Rogan mentions that constantly in his podcast.
Oh, does he?
Yeah. And so you'll have other groups that, people like Bill Maher or other people that'll just appeal to like very pseudo claims where like this is not accurate. Every single time, when right around Easter time, they use it on the History Channel, they'll have some sort of special documentary with like the Lost Gospels or like, did Jesus really rise from the dead? And they always bring in these like this like pseudo-Gnostic gospel. So I think it's, as a whole, this is representative of something that we need to have an answer to, because it's not just with the cults, but a lot of other religions, they will appeal to pseudo-history. Mm-hmm. And that's something we need to know for ourselves, but also to be able to give answers. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's pretty troubling because, we all know this in the age of the internet, that everyone is a scholar. Everyone who can get on the Google machine immediately becomes a scholar in what they just Googled. Yeah. And so that's problematic when you talk about things like this. It's problematic when you get your information from random YouTube content creators who don't list sources. They're right. They're just talking. And so these are the ways that these kind of ideas can proliferate, right? It's just the age of technology. No one has to be an expert anymore. No one has to study or original sources. You don't need to do that. You just need to find a voice to listen to and agree with them. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because it's almost like a lot of times just in internet, and this is interesting too, because I think just with the internet and how it's evolved the last 20 years. I mean, I'm 41, so I remember getting my first MySpace, going to Facebook. There's actually a meme that was posted recently. It was like MySpace, Facebook, Instagram. Like, this is when I was young, and that shows TikTok, and that's now I'm like super old. That's just, the internet has evolved a lot. Yeah. But I think with the involvement of the internet and the influencer age, is that you have a bunch of little like pseudo cult leaders that are out there. I'm sure there's probably a ton of Kemetic TikTok influencers. I haven't had a chance to even look those up, but I'm sure they're out there for sure.
Yeah.
They all like vary from each other, but people are just hungry for answers, and that's the social media is definitely a catalyst of that for sure. But even what was it? And I think a lot of times, though, when we talk about like internet argumentation, people have a meme of like the Bible being put together at the Council of Nicaea, and they have that meme, and they're like holding it back like a Dragon Ball Z, and all of a sudden they're arguing like, oh, there you go, got you.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating because for some, not all.
Yeah.
Some, not all. For some, memes become a point of source documentation and scholarship. So yeah.
Well, they'll tell you do your own research.
That is
as
prevalent.
a cop out to not have to cite their actual sources.
Yeah, and as a that's also very commonly the response to when you ask someone a specific question. The go-to phrase. Anyone who deals with the conscious community and for sure the Kemetic community understands and is well acquainted with the phrase "do your own research."
Right.
Yeah.
Where do they stand typically, like politically? Andrew, like Andrew just mentioned a moment ago, there's a couple of people that seem to be a lot more like woke associated or LGBTQ stuff, which tends to go towards the left wing of politics. But there is an article that you had sent me of a guy named Young Pharaoh, who is a rapper, but he was at he was participating in CPAC, which is a very well-known conservative organization, and Donald Trump is typically the main speaker there. But he was asked, apparently he was asked to step down and pull aside because he had tweets that were anti-Semitic. Where is there any? Is it kind of all over the place, or does it tend to focus a certain area?
Like most things, it is non-monolithic. That is going to be like probably the anthem of today. There's you cannot speak in absolutes. But you mentioned Young Pharaoh. Young Pharaoh is very much so a social media influencer, very prevalent. He had a YouTube following that numbered in just on YouTube, 500,000 people.
Yeah.
Facebook, I don't know the number there, but he started on Facebook. He had a huge following there. And so, yeah, he was, initially he was invited to be a speaker at CPAC. And then upon further investigation by those in charge, they realized that he might not be the person that you want to have a mic in front of at a convention like CPAC.
Do you know what he was talking about or doing that would have made him as someone who'd be a guest at CPAC?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I'm familiar with Young Pharaoh and his videos, and so me personally, I didn't need a reason to see why he was invited. I knew immediately that he shouldn't have been. So
okay, I gotcha.
So personally, I didn't look into it. That would be, I believe we might be talking about Young Pharaoh in a later episode. So I can look into that and see what was the draw.
Yeah, sounds good. Another question I have too, and Andrew, I'll let you jump in as well too, is when it comes to their level of argumentation or reasoning, and again it varies, but the claim is that Christianity is a European copy of Kemet spirituality. And there's a lot of times where in like pseudo-history or even like pseudo-etymology, they'll take something that kind of sounds similar and they'll make an association with it. And so I remember seeing this one video of this guy claiming that the Bible was an astrological text. It wasn't a Kemetic video, but because you mentioned that atom, A-T-U-M. But I remember this video, this guy was making an association with atom and Adam, right? The only association is that they kind of sort of rhyme a little bit.
In English.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you see examples like that in this?
Yeah, absolutely. Off the top of that is a really prevalent one.
Yeah.
That is one that is constantly, even though it gets debunked constantly, it reappears just as constantly. Another one, I might have to think about that, but there are several associations that are not associations at all. And it's just, you're hard pressed sometimes to convince people that just because a homophone exists in a language, it doesn't mean that there is a relation between those two homophones. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Very, very interesting. Andrew, what's on your mind? What are you thinking?
Yeah, I'm trying to think presuppositionally here. So if we have groups of people who believe in Kemetic thought or this conscious community in terms of Kemeticism, there's truth claims being made, which I wouldn't disagree in terms of colonialism and slavery being wrong, but I have a standard outside of myself that tells me these things are wrong because God says that man stealing is wrong, kidnapping is wrong, slavery is wrong in terms of the way the colonials did it, which is different than biblical indentured servitude. But what standard morally that are they appealing to make claims that these things are wrong? Because it's like it's easy in the position you sit in the modern West world, while we have Christianity that has massively influenced the way that we have mental thought incapacity in terms of morals as being something that's absolute in a sense, but then to have that standard of which is the society you live in, but then to say that God is wrong while you're angry with the things that have happened in the past, like what's their moral standard, I guess is what I'm asking. What law do they appeal to that is outside of themselves to say that those things are inherently evil and wrong?
Yeah, that's a good question because this can be spoken of as another example of the idea of their claim that Christianity copied ancient Egyptian religion. So one of the claims is that the 10 Commandments are a copy of what is called the 42 laws of Ma'at. Okay, and so have you heard of that?
Yep.
Yeah, yeah. And so Ma'at was a goddess in ancient Egyptian religion that represented harmony, balance, reciprocity, order, the antithesis of chaos. And so what would happen is that there's 42 laws of Ma'at. They're not really laws. That's another thing. The 10 Commandments are laws, right? Thou shalt not, thou shalt not. The 42 laws of Ma'at, I'd rather call them negative confessions, are confessions where you would start your day with saying, I will not do this. I will not do that. There's 42 of them. And then at the end of the day, you would say, I have not. That's not a law. That's not a law. So they would appeal to Ma'at. That is a code of ethics that governs their behavior. And so that is what they would appeal to. And again, it goes back to a deity, the goddess Ma'at. And so that's what they would appeal to. Very works-based, right? Very different from Christianity, which is wholly grace-based. Very works-based system. Mm-hmm. That's what they appeal to, a works-based system.
Yeah. Wasn't there, I think there was, as we were up here, I'm just curious as what you mentioned Ma'at, is there was one of the videos I was watching, it was just the very beginning of like a live stream that one of the leaders was doing. And he was introducing, people that are on the live stream, but he said something Ma'at, like how he greeted people. You know what I'm referring to? It's almost like, how someone who's Muslim, they say like salam alaikum or alaikum salam. It was basically a version of that. Do you know what I'm referring to?
Yeah.
It's one of the videos that you had sent me.
It could be, it could be just a reference to peace, right?
Okay.
Yeah. So the goal in Kemeticism, I guess I can't say that. There's many goals.
Yes.
But,
generally speaking.
Yeah.
As general as possible.
Yeah, yeah. Balance, order is something that you live for, that you shoot for. Mm-hmm. And as I said before, it is opposed to chaos. And so sometimes people even have the word Ma'at in their name as well. It's just really this idea of peace and balance, order. You don't want to be out of order.
Right.
You always want to be in a state of balance, and even things like justice, righteousness, reciprocity.
Oh, definitely very interesting. So why don't we do this? I mean, we've kind of given people a very general overview. Just real quickly, if anyone wants to find out more of like you and any of the other works, where can they find you at?
You can find me. I do not have my own YouTube channel, but I hop on other people's YouTube channels. So.
Okay. Well, you got a couple weeks till this comes out, so if you start your own YouTube channel, we'll give you a shout out.
I'll pray about it.
Yeah, it's all good.
So you can find me. There's an amazing urban apologist, Alfredo Valentin. He goes by the name of BK Apologist on YouTube. People should look him up and find him. You can find Adam Coleman, who is True ID Podcast. That's TRU, the real you, hyphen ID, Imago Dei, True ID, Apologetics. You can find him on YouTube. Look him up. Vocab Malone. Yeah. He's Vocab Malone on YouTube. Find him, look him up. There's just a few. Those are the few of the platforms that I frequent at this time.
Okay, awesome. So let's do this. I mean, you have not only do you know about them, but you've also have some experience too, on how to engage them with and bring up and address the objections that they bring up. So what we'll do is that we're going to probably address a little bit more of that in part 2. So if you guys enjoyed this episode, definitely let us know what you thought. Definitely a very interesting, uncharted territory here at Cultish, but there's no end in sight to where the gospel doesn't need to reach. So, thank you all for listening. We'll talk to you guys next week on Cultish. Talk to you guys soon.